Good morning, everyone. I am delighted to welcome Dr. Barbara K. Stripling to today's session. Dr. Stripling's leadership in school librarianship is extraordinary. Her career has spanned classroom teaching, school librarianship, administrative leadership, and teaching new professionals in school librarianship at Syracuse University's School of Information Studies. Her Stripling Model of Inquiry has become a cornerstone for teaching critical thinking and research skills in schools nationwide, and I am honored to have her expertise with us today to lead our conversation about teaching information literacy in today's complex information landscape. Barb, I know you want us to call you Barb today. Welcome to our coastal group. We are so thrilled to have you here.
Well, I am really glad to join you all and glad to engage with you in a conversation.
And before we dive in, Barb, you mentioned that when we talked that you have some Colorado roots. Would you share a bit about that with everyone?
The what? I'm sorry.
You mentioned when we talked that you have some Colorado roots. Would you mind sharing a bit about that with everyone?
Well, I lived in Boulder I've taught English and drama in Pueblo, Colorado, and then moved to Boulder and got a master's in drama and communications, and couldn't get a teaching job in Colorado. So I was sad about that. In Boulder, I got the job in Pueblo and loved my time living in both Pueblo and Boulder. I feel like I do have roots there. I also worked, interestingly enough, when I couldn't find a teaching job in Boulder, I worked for KBTV in Denver,
Wow.
and and I worked for the film division of it, Barbary Productions. I'm not sure if it still exists. It was a small independent filmmaking agency connected with KBTV. So I commuted from Boulder to Denver for a couple of years.
Oh my gosh. I love that. So we have actually Jen Maley is from Pueblo. She's with us today. And Jill Weaver from Jeffco Public Schools. She graduated from Centennial High School in Pueblo. So you guys
Oh,
may have crossed paths at some point.
yeah, we may have. It was a long
I
time
know I
ago.
can speak for Ray from Boulder Valley that should you want to come out of retirement, Boulder Valley would hire you back in a second.
Oh, I would love it. It is a wonderful place to live.
All right, well, we're going to jump right in with our first question. So let me advance our slide deck here. And throughout today's session, sorry, I should have already showed this one. Throughout today's session, if you have questions, drop them into the chat. Today's session will be a conversation. We have some questions to structure that. At some point, we may pause and take some questions from the chat, but no matter what, I'll be collecting those. So at the end, when we have more time to really dive into Q&A, I can ask Barb the questions that have that filtered up during our discussion. So we're going to kick it off with quite a doozy of a question. How can teacher librarians teach all the information literacy skills that students need in the fast changing climate of information, misinformation, and disinformation?
Well, a simple answer is we can't. We shouldn't even try and shouldn't feel guilty that we're not trying. You can tell from my background in inquiry that I believe in putting students in charge of their own learning. So they are partly responsible for learning the skills that they don't have. And of course, we identify the priority skills and teach those, but then actually we make sure that students understand their role in learning and that they become learners. Um, in my opinion, the best way to do that is by building a culture of inquiry in the school. So it's important for me anyway, to differentiate, to define what inquiry actually means. And it's not a rote research process. It's not a collection of skills, of information literacy skills. It really is a stance that I hope all learners develop where they ask questions. They're curious about the world, and then they pursue those answers according to um, their own interests, their own abilities, their own passion. And there's a lot of emotional aspects to inquiry as well as academic and intellectual aspects. The core really rests with students, their own interests and curiosities. And I don't know if you all have experienced the same thing that I did, which was I was a K-12 librarian in Pueblo. And I it was interesting that not in Pueblo, in Arkansas, sorry. And it was interesting to me that I saw at least by middle school, kids had dampened down their own curiosity and they followed the lead of the teacher. They did what the teacher asked and didn't feel free to pursue their own interests or go deeper into something that they really cared about. So a culture then of inquiry honors kids' curiosity and their ability to pursue their interests. It's personalized. It matters who the students are and what they think. So it gets away from generic information literacy skills and dives deeper into students making meaning, personal meaning for what they find. So they may find a fact, and it's their responsibility then to ask questions of that fact. Is this true? Is this not true? How do I know it's true? Now, we can provide the basics for those questions and should, as we're teaching kids to evaluate information. But really, the kids themselves are the drivers of that questioning, of that pursuit, and it's structured around. I personally think of inquiry as a conversation. I guess maybe you all have noticed the same way I have that we don't generate conversation very much in the classroom, or at least I didn't learn to do that when I was in the classroom. I would call for a discussion, but I asked the questions. And then I gave one or two people the opportunity to answer, but never to interact with each other and never to generate their own questions. Well, inquiry needs to be that interactive sense of questioning texts, of questioning each other, of listening to answers, of um, gathering information from texts, but then questioning its validity. And to me, that kind of an imperative to engage in interactive conversation with ourselves, with others, and with texts that we read. That's the way that we make sure our students become information literate without our trying to teach every single skill that they might need. Um,
Barb, that's something that really, when we chatted, that really resonated with me because I started my career as a classroom teacher, teaching third grade. And when you talked about it, teaching it through conversations, I just felt like, okay, that lifts the burden off this one person, off the teacher librarian to cover all the bases when it can be as simple as almost a mindset for all of the conversations that we're having And I think about the interactions that I was able to have with my classroom students and how how easily it would have been to really change conversations to be more inquiry based versus trying to coordinate with one other professional in the building to teach all the things. And, but I'm also thinking about there has to be someone who leads that charge to change how we have those conversations.
Yeah.
So, kind of as an extra question would be, so how do you see the role of the teacher librarian in kind of shifting everyone's gears to start to adopt that mindset of having conversations that are inquiry based?
Well, I think one thing is to be explicit about it in your conversations with classroom teachers. And when you're collaborating and planning, co-planning and everything, I remember there was a huge shift in my collaboration with classroom teachers, designing instruction and lessons, when I moved from teacher-driven to student-driven learning. And it sounds like, just a shift, but what it came from was my changing my initial question from what do what are your objectives for this unit, for this lesson, to what do you want your students to understand as a result of this? And all of a sudden, it changed the perspectives of the teachers I was working with. And they went, oh, it's not just grabbing facts, it's not just accumulating information. I really want kids to process this, and I want to focus on what the kids are going to be doing, not on what I'm going to be doing. Uh, it, and so that's one way to spread that culture of inquiry is in the questions that we engage in with the teachers as we're co-planning. And another thing, and I was going to talk about this at a later question, but I'll go ahead and say it, and that is to be explicit about inquiry and an inquiry process with students so that when we design something to empower them to ask questions, we need to be explicit. Look at you. We're teaching you how to ask your own questions and to ask questions that are deeper than just collecting facts. Yay! Let's celebrate our advancement. We're doing inquiry together. And so using those terms explicitly, making kids aware of an inquiry process and of the power that they get from, for that they get for driving their own learning, that's one way to spread that culture among students as well.
That seems like the perfect segue into question two. Can you tell us a little bit about the Stripling Model of Inquiry and what you believe is that most important stage of the inquiry process?
Yay! I get to talk about construct. Um, let me tell you just a little bit about how I developed this model, because it didn't just come out of the blue. When I first started as a librarian, and my first library jobs were in Arkansas, what I noticed was that kids had become school wise. They knew exactly how to complete their assignments, and it was to go grab some information and plop it over here in the assignment. There, done, no problem. Um, and they never thought about it. No kids ever thought about it. They just got it done. Of course, I was junior high and high school mostly, so they're jaded at that point. They know how to succeed. Um, but I actually named that syndrome. I called it the brown bear is brown syndrome. And it was characterized by kids coming in. They had to do research on an animal and they didn't care. And so they picked the bear. because they knew there were bears and they knew a lot about bears and they weren't going to have to work or think. And so they went right to the encyclopedias. Now, you've got to remember, this was a long time ago, and we actually had print encyclopedias, and kids gravitated to them. So they would pull out the B volume, and it wasn't for bear, it was for brown. But eventually they would find an article about bears and brown bears, and they would start copying. The brown bear is brown. And I saw that all the time. So I decided right then I was going to teach students how to think critically and not just grab up information. My fellow librarian, Judy Pitts, and I developed a research process then to build in critical thinking skills at every step of the process. And we published a book and based our whole instructional program on that research process. What I discovered, though, was that that was too linear and too regimented. And so there was a step one and a step two and a step three, and it just didn't match real learning. So I started doing a lot of research myself. And things that I researched were like authentic learning. And what does that mean? Authentic assessment. What does that mean? Critical thinking skills. How do you even teach critical thinking skills? Instructional design, teaching for understanding, constructivism, social constructivism. And I found those ideas inspirational. So I started thinking about, okay, what does it have to be? And that's why I came up with the model of inquiry, which captured a lot of those ideas. And even though you can't see those ideas in there, they're in there. Express is certainly authentic assessment. It's authentic learning. And I've built critical thinking skills throughout the process. So that seemed to work for me in directing learning, in guiding students. And another piece that was really important is the recursiveness. So you can see the arrows go both ways. And that's natural. Kids may get all the way to investigate, they have questions, and they figure out, well, that was a stupid question. That didn't lead to anything. Well, then they go back and they work on the questions, and there's no penalty for the recursiveness. It is part of the natural process of learning. I'm interested in and have been interested in how the world of information has changed and why this model is so important in the embedding of critical thinking skills. When I was a librarian in Fayetteville, high school librarian, I had a kid come to me and say, I want to research the history of chocolate. Well, you all have to realize there wasn't really the internet at that point, if anybody can even imagine. But I lived before there was an internet. We looked through our entire library. We had nothing on the history of chocolate. So I finally kind of found a little bit. It was just the beginning of online access, and we kind of found a little bit, but he was collecting facts on the history of chocolate, and that's what his product really was. It was based on his interest, but now think of what kids can find out about the history of chocolate. And all of a sudden, they're responsible for more than just finding information. They're responsible for finding controversial issues and different perspectives and recognizing that it was based on slave labor and that there were a lot of child labor issues and slavery issues connected with the history of chocolate. And all of a sudden, that becomes a relevant thing to ask about. It's not just what is the history of chocolate, it's what were the social implications of chocolate when it was first developed. So this inquiry model represents a shift from just finding information to thinking about the information you find and seeking other things about that topic or theme that you didn't even suspect were there, and challenging yourself to look for competing viewpoints and controversial perspectives and multicultural perspectives on your topic. So it leads me to the main idea that you asked about my favorite aspect of this model, and that is construct. And I think it's probably obvious to you all why that is my favorite phase of inquiry, uh, countering kids' inclination to move directly from investigate to express, and never drawing their own conclusions, never becoming a part of the learning. They just take information from here and put it over here, but it never goes through their head. So that by pulling it out to its own phase of inquiry, I am expecting students to develop critical thinking skills about how to develop an opinion and support it with evidence, how to push back and challenge different sources, different authors, different perspectives, but have evidence that supports your different conclusions or whatever conclusions you make. Understand your own personal imprint on what the information is you find. And then you can actually stand up and express what you found with confidence because you have thought it through and you have the evidence to support what you thought. So you have a voice, you have agency, you become the learner and the expert in whatever subject you're presenting. So that's essentially kind of the origin of this model and the value I place on construct.
And Barb, thinking about, when and I think when you were saying about being explicit, I'm thinking about the schools that I've taught in during my career, and I've never been in a school where we had a model of inquiry. And I know that when I surveyed districts in Colorado prior to our workshop today, there are several that don't have like a district-wide model. So I'm wondering, like, how does adopting a model of inquiry like the Stripling model support student learning? What do you feel like are the strengths of that?
Well, it's interesting because that is my experience as well. Even the science teachers didn't recognize that there was a scientific model, that even they didn't get it. And I had a couple of teachers who recognized the value of having a hypothesis, but then they don't recognize then how do you prove or disprove or the whole sequence of things. So I think when a school develops a model or adopts a model, it makes the learning process more transparent. It's transparent to teachers when in your planning sessions you say, okay, well, where are they in this learning process? Are you at the very beginning of understanding, of your kids understanding, getting ready to do fashion in the 1920s. That's what kids would, my girls loved fashion projects. And I had to work really hard to help them think more deeply than just collecting pictures of different fashion. So let's say a teacher is doing the 1920s. Well, the class needs to start with the context. They need to understand what was going on in the 1920s. Why did we call it the Roaring Twenties? What was the mood of the country and the climate and why? And that's at the first phase of inquiry. But then, if teachers understand, it goes beyond that to more specific investigation of what were the implications of that mood for individual people. Why were the fashion choices made that were made? And the same is true with anything students would have pursued, like music or um, politics or anything was set by that context, but then students had to go deeper. So they didn't just have a peripheral understanding of a few facts about the 1920s, but they actually understood the implications, social, cultural, intellectual implications of that initial overview information. So certainly having a model of inquiry where teachers understand how students work through developing a new understanding is really important. It's also important for students. Um, one of my favorite memories was a student coming back to me after her first semester in college. And she came in, she was back in town for Christmas vacation, and she came into the library and she said, I just had to tell you that I was the only one prepared to do research in our English course where we had to do a research paper. And she was just glowing. She was so self-satisfied. But what she told me was that she remembered there was a process that she had to follow. And none of her fellow students knew that process. So they leapt right to selecting a topic, finding stuff, and sending it and finishing. And she said, but no, I knew I had to follow this process. So I did. And I got some general information and then I asked questions and I figured out a really good questions. And then I had a focus for my research. And I thought about it and I created this essay. And she said, I was the only one among my friends who got an A on my research essay. And she credited it to actually understanding the process that she had to go through. So, just as for teachers, we need to be transparent about the process, I think the same is true for students. When they understand a process, they feel okay about not getting all the information that they can find, because now what they need to find is information that answers their questions, and they're more focused and they can plan their own research. They recognize, okay, I'm at this phase. I need to move to this one and in order to finish on time, rather than waiting till the night before and trying to glom all the information into one spot. And I remember when I was a student, I was a good student. We would do research papers and I would do note cards. And so my job was to collect as many note cards as I could and then to cram all of that into the final product. I always had to figure out some way to get this extraneous fact in there. They must have been terrible papers, but had a lot of information. um, So essentially, the model helps planning instruction, delivering instruction, and students using that model and the embedded skills to succeed in developing new understanding.
And I imagine that it creates this common language that everyone is speaking, oh, it looks like you're in the connect phase, or like I've noticed that you did a lot of great investigation, but I really want to see you construct new understanding using those key vocabulary to really make it a cyclical learning process so that by the time kids leave our buildings, they have that process so ingrained because we've used that common language. I'm thinking of, so many schools you'll walk into and you'll see an acronym on the wall that stands for one letter might be R for respect, or it stands for the values that that school
Mhm.
community has. And I think it's for those same reasons. It just creates this common language around how do we want to be with one another? And I think this is, to me, strikes me very similar. It helps
Mhm.
accelerate that learning and cement it because you have that common language.
And you know, it's interesting. I think it also relieves guilt a little bit. If teachers and students recognize we're not going to go deeply into this one, we just got to collect some facts. That's okay. It's okay to come into the library for one day and collect facts because you recognize you're at the connect phase. That's what you're doing. You're just getting the landscape. Fine. Don't feel guilty. You don't have to do a full inquiry project every time. You know where you are. Today, we're just coming in to brainstorm the best questions. We're not going to spend time answering all of those. You can do that on your own if you're interested. But let's understand that there are lots of questions about this. And today, that's what we're focusing on.
But I love, though, that you're also alluding to in that conversation that there is more to the process. We're not doing it today, but there is more. And I think
Yeah,
that's such a valuable message.
yeah.
This is the part that I am most excited about. In your new book that is coming out in June, and remind me of the title, please.
Teaching inquiry as conversation, bringing wonder to life.
Thank you. And in that book, you've developed portraits of engaged and empowered learners, and they focus on the whole child. It includes elements like cultural responsiveness, strong self-identity, future mindset. Could you please explain this framework and why taking a whole child inquiry approach is so important?
I didn't actually realize this until the last few years. I thought my job as a librarian was to teach the academic learning skills, and that was what my lessons were on. What I didn't recognize was at the same time, I was building skills and attitudes that enabled kids to develop fully. And the library is an essential piece of most schools because kids can be themselves. They're not being evaluated. They can pursue their own interests. They can figure out who they are. They can identify with others who are not like them, have conversations because we none of us have the libraries. Um, and really build relationships with other students and with me as a librarian. Building trust that we're going to treat each other well, understand where we come from, honor different perspectives. So I started researching whole child learning, and there actually is some good research about the value of the emotions and the social aspects to learning. Uh, I don't know if all of you all know the catchphrase, learning is social, but it really is. It depends on interaction and on conversations. Um, so I worked with a team in New York City, a team of librarians and tech specialists, and we developed competencies that we thought brought in more than just the independent learning, academic learning competencies, but also how do we help kids develop their own humanness, to value their humanity and who they are as people. Uh, I remember one of the pieces that I had developed was I do graphic organizers in my sleep all the time, but one of the ones was often in elementary school, we ask students to um, identify their strengths, and so they think, oh well, I'm a good student or something, and but they don't think about the strengths that they have as people. Who am I? How am I different? Yeah, I'm a girl, but what does that mean? What else do I have? What am I good at? We identified, or I actually identified, the aspects that allow kids to develop strengths, to recognize their own strengths in a number of different ways. And so independent learning competencies are really the academic critical thinking skills. And what do we expect second grader kids to have accomplished by second grade, fifth grade, eighth grade, and 12th grade? And we picked those as kind of benchmark years because those are transition years in a lot of ways. They move to the next level. And so then we thought, well, what is it important for kids to develop, to become full human beings, to flourish in all areas of their lives? And we recognize that developing a strong self identity is essential. Kids don't need to be classified by someone else. Well, you're in this group, or you're this, or you're that. No, they need to figure out who they are. And this is especially important, I think, in our multicultural classrooms and world, where kids value their own perspective. They value the family. They recognize that they have many aspects to themselves. And one piece is, who am I? Who am I? The social and emotional attributes, I don't know how many of you all have credited the value or the importance of emotional reaction to information. You know, I was thinking, okay, so a benign research project in third grade is picking a favorite pet, but kids react differently to different things like that. In high school, if they're thinking about uh, pets or something, and somebody uh, thinks about medical research and how that, uh, I have a gerbil. Is that used for medical research? That they bring emotion to things. They bring emotion to controversial issues. And often adults have emotional reactions, which we see on social media all the time, without ever even thinking through. And to recognize, yeah, I have feelings. It matters to me. I remember once I had a student who decided he was going to research, they were researching social issues, and he was going to do abortion. And okay, okay, we can work through this. And then he said, but I already have all the information because my mom gave it to me. And so I recognized that feelings about abortion were going to override any research on that. So I had to work with him specially. Um, Cultural responsiveness is something that we do on a superficial level a lot of times. We'll have uh, a month to celebrate a different heritage or um, a display of books about different heritages and cultures. But really, there are skills that kids need to learn to be able to respect and interact and honor and understand different cultural perspectives. So that's an important aspect of becoming a human in our world today. Voice and agency is one of my favorite categories because students don't develop voice. We don't give them a chance to say, this is what I have discovered, that I'm an expert, and this is what I know, and this is why. One of my favorite occasions when I was in New York City, I was director of school libraries in New York City, and we would have renovation of libraries sponsored by an outside Heart of America Foundation. And so I was going to the opening of one of these newly renovated libraries, and I was sitting there with the small group of invited guests, and I was next to a kid. I think he was probably second grade, so we're sitting waiting for it to start. And all of a sudden he turned to me and he said, ask me anything about American presidents. And I went, hello. I was just, and he said, I have read every book on US presidents in this library, and you can ask me anything. I'm an expert. And I just went, yeah, that's what voice and agency is. I hope he didn't lose it after second grade. I hope he continued to see himself as an expert. But that's what we want to have all of our kids develop. And then the growth mindset. Absolutely. Do we want our kids to say, okay, 12th grade through, out, not learning anymore? That's not a way to continue growing. So we can help kids develop that. And it starts with little ideas, even in early elementary school. Um, how are you like this character? And how do you see yourself in that situation? And then moving on to career and college expectations and just setting high goals for yourself and understanding how you can continue to learn and flourish by um, looking at the future and figuring out, well, what do I want to do? How do I want to grow? So I don't know if that um, explains everything. I do think that these portraits are valuable to share with both teachers and students so that you develop a continuum approach to student development. I'm continually frustrated by the expectation that we're going to teach citations starting in third grade and we're going to teach in fourth and fifth, and there's no other expectations that we're going to get more complicated or teach other things at the later grades. And so by seeing ourselves as we hope to accomplish at these benchmark years, it kind of sets expectations for growth.
You read my mind. I was just thinking, so if I'm a teacher librarian and I'm looking at these portraits and thinking, well, yes, absolutely, that is that portrait of a 12th grade learner. That's my end goal. That's what I want to work towards. How does that change my everyday practice? And so I
Mhm.
think what I'm hearing from you is number one, it creates expectations. Are there other things that come to mind how having these portraits that are commonly shared amongst your school staff might change how what the day-to-day looks like, especially when we're thinking about information literacy instruction?
Well, I think it broadens our perspective on what we can and should teach. And it also makes it more a part of everyday experiences in the library. So, what we can recognize by looking at these is that it doesn't have to be a research lesson, it doesn't have to be a research unit. When you're reading a story to elementary kids, voice and agency just pop up all the time. And you can do it maybe not through a structured lesson, but through a conversation. Well, how are you strong in that area? What do you think about this character? Um, and letting them express their own opinions and ideas and feelings in a simple read aloud session. Well, they aren't really simple if you plan them, but recognizing that the idea of empathy deserves a conversation all the time when kids are in the library. It's not just developing empathy during research, but it's listening empathetically to others. It's in the collaborative conversations that kids have with each other. It's kids understanding that every other student has different strengths and different areas of challenge, and understanding that to the point where you embrace the idea that we're different and that we can work together to accomplish something. So I think having these portraits in mind really lifts the responsibility for having structured lessons on everything, and it becomes more a part of we're all in this together and we're going to develop as full human beings. But we need to continue to develop. You don't stay with second grade attitudes all the way until you graduate. You need to have deeper, more complex understandings of what it means to be empathetic, for example.
Just listening to you, I'm realizing I think that is why these portraits resonate with me so much is they just the school library staff, they're the perfect it's really that perfect person and perfect place to be able to develop a lot of these attributes that
Yes.
may not, easily be an objective that comes straight from standards, but when we're thinking about who are we trying to support and how do we empower and engage our learners, and I just think that this so beautifully represents a lot of the work that we do as school librarians. So thank you for bringing this to light.
Yeah.
Uh, so this is kind of the antithesis. This is kind of the antithesis of that question, but also thinking about those things that we do as school librarians, like teaching citations and helping students develop keywords for searches or how to do lateral reading. So this is kind of all about that. Does direct instruction play a role in using an inquiry model? And how do librarians balance teaching those specific information literacy skills with facilitating that inquiry process?
Yeah, that's an interesting question to me. And I realize that we kind of put uh, bad connotation, if not further than that, on direct instruction. And that direct instruction definitely is important. in a number of areas. I remember trying to help a group of librarians think of how they would teach some skills in early elementary or elementary. And I realized that a lot of times we say, well, make an inference, but we never teach kids how to make an inference. Some develop it naturally or through their family or something, and others are going, huh? What? So we have to teach it. The best way I have found, I think, to blend direct instruction with an inquiry model is through the gradual release of responsibility model. Now, I'm not sure if all of you all approach teaching in that way, but this was pivotal in my thinking about instruction. And essentially, what gradual release of responsibility means is that you start with a very direct instruction lesson where you're teaching the skills, the process, and modeling it for the students. But then you move to the next phase, which is guided practice. And that's where conversation really plays a major part, where you work together as a class and class discussion. You work through using the skill in a specific with a specific content area and develop kind of an understanding of what it would be like to do that. And then you move to independent practice where students are trying it on their own or in a small group to use that skill in learning content, and finally to reflection and sharing. So when you peg this gradual release of responsibility with a skill at a certain phase in the inquiry process, then that is a way to bring together the type of learning that you expect in a way that uh, brings people through the teacher in charge to the student in charge, which is the whole goal of the inquiry model, really. But you can do it in a very measured way, building directly within a single lesson, even from direct instruction to uh, student decision making and student independent learning. I I found that direct instruction doesn't necessarily mean whole class regimented instruction. That you might do direct instruction when you encounter a kid trying to answer a question or find information or find a good resource. That those moments of direct instruction are important as long as then you empower the kid to do it himself. I had the bad practice the first few years as a librarian of a student encountering a student who was struggling in some way. Often it was even finding a resource that would be relevant. And ever the helpful librarian, I would just go to the shelf and pull the book and say, here, page 42, without ever helping the kid ask the kinds of questions or teaching the student how to use the catalog or how to use the table of contents or the index. I would kind of take over, make sure they got the information. That was the end goal, but it was my thinking, not the students. So I think direct instruction, you need to be fairly explicit. We always say librarians are here to support, we're here to guide, we're also here to instruct. And the students would have been much better served if I had worked with them to think of what could they look up in the catalog to find a book on that. Well, are there other terms you could look up? What terms are you going to use to find something on the internet? How are you going to narrow in and get what you want? And so I had some learning to do about the role of direct instruction and how important it actually is.
I relate to you also as a parent. It's like there's so many examples as a parent of like when it's just easier just to go and do the thing, but how
I
bad
know.
it is, and
Yeah.
but
I
also
love
time.
the dioramas and all of that that kids come in with, and some the parent has worked really hard on. Yeah. I was at the high school where I was in Arkansas. It was a joke among all of us teachers because a parent had come in and complained to the principal, and the word got out among all of us that the parent said, "Well, I have never gotten less than an A on any of my projects." Yeah, the student got a B or something, and the parent just fully admitted the parent had written it.
Well, this question is somewhat related. It's really trying to strike a balance of what are the things that I need to do in terms of direct instruction versus really focusing on the process. And this one is guided towards how do I take this already existing curriculum and integrate an inquiry model and how could it support that existing curriculum. So if you're thinking about the curriculum's already been adopted either school-wide or district-wide, how do I add this layer that will really deepen students' learning to this existing curriculum?
Well, there's a couple of ways to look at curriculum, really. There is a library curriculum that you need to have. The first thing I would do, though, is to connect to the curriculum of classroom teachers. And so, how do you do that? Well, it's, I think, important to actually pull down the documents because there are accepted curricula for major subject areas, maybe not online for every subject taught in the school, but certainly for the core areas. And that's a good understanding for us to have and conversations to have with the teachers. But even more important, perhaps, than that, the standards, the curriculum standards, is the actual curriculum. And so what we find when we have conversations with teachers is that, well, we don't have time to do this, so we eliminate that. And I actually spend longer here because I think it helps the students more. When I was going to high school, we never touched World War One and forward because we ran out of time. So that was not part, it was part of the, I'm sure, the written curriculum, but not the actual curriculum. Now, those conversations with teachers about the curriculum, I think we need to approach those the same way we approach individual lessons, that we don't walk in and say, well, what are the standards and what are your objectives? But we say, what do you most want kids to understand about American history? And how does that work? Are there areas that are more higher priority than others? And do you want to go deeply in some areas rather than others? What do you want them to understand about this particular phase of history? What do you want students to understand? And so that then leads to a conversation about, well, what do kids need to be able to do to understand that? So, do they need to have deeper work on multiple perspectives? Do they need to dive deep into just understanding the context? So, I think the conversation is kind of natural that you drill in with the teachers, not starting by planning specific lessons or units. It's by understanding what their actual curriculum is and where they see students needing thinking skills and deep reading skills and finding credible resources skills uh, to deepen their students' understanding of the major ideas. Now, I think the next step after you kind of have a curriculum map of the school, which I love visuals, and so that would be very beneficial to me, is to think about then a curriculum map for the library. And that's based on the priorities of the teachers, as we said, and of the administrators. Uh, we have whole schools that their main focus is literacy. Well, we can help with that, and we can interject that into various departments and assignments and whatever. We can be teaching that, but that needs to be on our curriculum then, so we understand. And so, a good way to approach this is to take the conversations with teachers about the kinds of skills they see their kids needing to develop and developing a curriculum map for our own library program. Now, the advantage to that is, well, there are several. One is it's explicit now, and you can have conversations then with departments if you're in high school or middle school, or with grade level teams, and say, okay, of this map, what would you prioritize for your grade level or your department? What we find is, what I have found is that when we come back with an overall map, um, we find that teachers always start from ground zero. So if they want students to be able to make a claim, first of all, a lot of them just tell students to make a claim. That, and there's nowhere in anybody who's teaching kids to make a claim. But if there is, then every year where students are expected to make a claim, they have to start over. But when you have a map for the school, we can say, okay, we're going to teach kids to make a claim in seventh grade. And then they're going to add personal voice to the claim in eighth grade when they do soapbox speeches. And and so teachers will be able to see how supportive the integration is and how they can build off of what's happening in other classrooms at other grade levels. I found that I would encounter English teachers who felt every year they had to teach note taking because they didn't know what the previous year, what the teacher had taught, and they didn't know what the library had taught. And so we taught note taking in sophomore biology because that's what kids needed. Well, then the sophomore English teachers didn't have to do that because all of their students were getting instruction in a different subject area. Well, there's no opportunity in a school for teachers who are at a different grade level or a different subject to really talk about that development of skills. The cross section occurs in the library, and it occurs when we have this library curriculum as a continuum where we have then looked at the different academic areas. And as a school, we have determined, okay, this is the best place for our kids to learn this skill. And we'll integrate it into the some experience or activity in that subject area. And then other teachers can help students practice it, but expect students to have the basic instruction. And it enables us to set higher expectations for critical thinking across the school. We're not all starting from ground zero every year.
And keep engagement high, just thinking of the students that are experiencing the reteaching of skills over and over. So to be able to keep those kids more engaged. And I love the concept of the library as that cross section.
Yeah, yeah, it's really a strength, I think. Um, oh, AI. Oh,
Oh,
yeah.
you got to have at least one question about AI. So thinking about 2025, what shifts in our teaching are most urgent when we're thinking about the emergence of AI? And what specific approaches can librarians take to ensure students are still doing that cognitive construction work of making meaning rather than just grabbing that AI generated information?
Yeah, it's a thorny issue that we're all dealing with, and I don't think anybody has beautiful solutions yet. But I am thinking about it in a number of ways. First of all, there are positive uses of AI, and we need to not take the approach, "Ugh, nobody's ever going to use AI and it's totally worthless," and because that's not reality. There are ways to use it positively. Business is figuring out a lot of ways, and there are places where it would be valuable for students to use AI. Of course, we have to have a conversation with students, though, about what AI is and why it's helpful in some ways and what are the dangers that they might encounter. And so it's that honest conversation, I think, that will help students be more conscious of how they're going to use AI. Of course, there are strategies that we can use in instruction that help uh, demand cognitive thinking. That's not quite the right word, but um, certainly in the development of final products of what the kids are producing. We need to think about interjecting the types of assignments or designing the types of assignments that can't be copied, that can't be done by AI, and that require originality, the personal touch, this person's attitude, this person's opinions, not an AI generated opinion. And um, I think we can do that a lot. For example, designing an assignment where students take the role of the prospector and the role of the agency that is collecting the ore and where they have to develop a personal slant will be more likely to have to be generated by the student's own thinking than AI generated. There are also in-process things that I think are part of inquiry and need to be included even if we didn't have AI, and that is reflective thinking throughout the process, where you're capturing the students' thinking, where you're capturing their process. And there are a number of things we can do. We can ask students to do a process folio where they are capturing their thinking at each phase of inquiry. We can ask them to do interactive note taking so that they are putting their own responses to the information that they find, and that being a part um, of their of what they turn in and what you can share with them. I remember once I had worked with a group and they did learning log note taking all the way through their research. And so on the final day, when they were supposed to be working on their first draft, they came into the library and I said, okay, put away your notes. And they're going, what? And I said, trust me, put away all of your notes. And now write your first draft. And what they realized, what the students realized, was that they had already thought through their notes. And their first draft was not copying the information, it was sharing what they had already thought through. And the teacher came and said, I have never gotten such a valuable collection of first drafts. It made a huge difference in the quality of the work that the students produce. So building that kind of thinking and holding kids accountable for that at every step, I think is one counter to AI. Even if it's AI generated information, they have to think about it. So they have to show whether it's valid or not and what they thought about it. Um, now, there are other problems, and I think it's very hard for kids to resist. Plagiarism is much easier to do, and I don't really blame the kids in a lot of ways. It's open, it's available, it's easier, and so I can understand why it is so attractive, and not just kids, it's to every adult. So I think one thing that we can do is make it a whole school effort, and as a whole school, develop a policy on AI so that every teacher and every student is aware of their responsibilities and of how AI is going to be treated in the school. And the
And
policy doesn't mean we're banning all AI from everything, because that's the wrong approach.
I think there's value in every teacher with each assignment thinking through that, what level of AI,
Yes,
could be
yes.
used. And yeah, yeah. I love the idea of the process. Do you say process portfolio?
No, I say process folio.
Portfolio.
I
I
don't know.
love that
Kind of
idea.
made that up.
Well, I have taken up all of most of this time, and I want to make sure our audience has a chance to answer questions. So I skipped over that last question, which we could loop back to if there's time, but I really want to hear from you all. This is your time to either drop into the chat or come off of mute to ask Barb a question of your own. What's been brewing for you as you've been listening?
Well, I don't really have a question, but I do want to say thank you. A lot of what you said resonates with me very much. I always wondered coming into education why we don't let all the young people that we work with know about all the things we're learning about learning development and how we learn best. And we teach them a lot of things, but we don't teach them those things. And so I really resonated with a lot of what you said and appreciate your thinking through this and the models that you've created.
Thank you, Felicia.
And then Carol just dropped into the chat, wondering what was the process to create the Empire State Information Fluency Continuum? Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah. It's a
At
mouthful.
at the state level, and how was this different from the school and district level?
Okay, I'll briefly explain. I came to New York City as the director with a continuum already drafted. I've been working on it for a number of years, but the miracle was that we had a week-long professional development session with lead librarians in New York City. There was a group, we had about 20, and we spent the week digging in to all of the content area standards, to everything we could find, as well as what I had brought, the curriculum I had bought. And we just really tried to figure out what were the essential skills that were in the national standards, state standards, and content areas as well. And so that was our first development of the ESIFC. And we refined it. We have refined it several times. So when we first posted it, it was really essentially New York City information fluency continuum. And we were also we're a system, as there were other library systems in New York State, kind of regional systems. And so through conversation with that, every other director of a library system across the state decided that that was the curriculum that we wanted to adopt for New York. And at that point, it became the New York State Information Fluency Continuum. And so it's called Empire State. That's where the ESIFC came from. And we put it on a website for common access for everyone. And then it became used by all of the districts in degrees of use. Not everybody went full bore on it, but that was how it moved from a district level to a state level. It was because we had an organization that enabled us to go statewide. Now, you all have the same kind of thing now with your lead librarians, because you have lead librarians in every area of the state. And it's that conversation among you all that will help lift any initiative from a locally generated to a statewide.
Carol, did you have any follow-up questions that you wanted to ask? That's very kind.
Yes, and you have Susie. That's totally true.
Carol, your audio is not coming through.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much for that response. I really appreciate your information. Yeah, it feels like we're just on the cusp of looking at some of the questions that you've been answering for years. So thank you so much.
Well, there will be more questions for all of us to answer. It just keeps going, doesn't it?
What other questions are out there? What else are you all thinking about? Or potential challenges that you're wondering about?
I have a challenge, and this is both personally and with students, is with background knowledge and balancing that with inquiry and like the volume of information so many times. Even if I see a post that like I kind of support or like, I don't want to repost it because I don't have time to verify before I amplify. And the same thing with students. I feel like that's where a lot of it falls apart because I try to teach them to fact check, but if their background knowledge is either false or totally zero, then it's really hard for all of that to continue.
I totally understand. Nowadays, it seems like kids are receiving most of their information from TikTok and social media that they're not doing the background information access that they need to do to be sure that what they're reading is actually accurate. Um, Countering that is tough. I I don't know, teaching the critical deep reading skills may be one solution. I know that there's a lot of controversy, not controversy, but misunderstanding of the role of the librarian in literacy, in teaching literacy. And some people think it's, well, we're not teaching decoding, so we don't have any role. But really, our role is to teach kids the skills of deep reading, of interacting with what they read. And so part of what we can teach is taking one TikTok, one example, and as a group working together, the responsibility to push back, to ask questions, to figure out what does this mean. Background knowledge is easy to grab, but as you say, it's not always accurate, and the kids don't always have what they need. And so perhaps teaching the skill of questioning the text is making kids responsible for asking the right questions, even if they don't have time to find all the answers. At least they know that they're grabbing inaccurate information. So it might be helpful.
And I wonder about, just emphasizing the importance of, how you're saying with the inquiry model, how both the arrows go both ways, and how, we find this information, and all the more important right now to be focused on the wonder and the curiosity around that information and accuracy and skills like lateral reading, but labeling it with that wonder piece of, okay, well, I investigated, but now I really need to go back to wondering about where did this come from, and what was their perspective, or what was maybe their motive for sharing this information, that kind of thing.
Yeah, kids don't realize how biased and opinionated the information they're reading is. So that question of who is the author, what are their credentials, what's their authority, is essential.
I think we have time for one last question, if there are any other burning questions out there. If not, I'll ask my last question. If we could just focus on one or two things this year to strengthen inquiry-based learning and information literacy in our schools, what would you recommend?
I think I would recommend figuring out an inquiry-based experience that will touch every student in the school and being explicit about it. So not all in full inquiry units. It's when you're reading a story, being explicit. Well, we're going to engage in inquiry. Let's read the story by asking our own questions. And so just even in displays, are we just putting something up, or are we putting something that causes kids to think in new ways and being explicit about, well, now what questions do you have? We have this display, having a wonder board where kids can post their own questions and their answers and responses. So thinking about what we do as librarians to build a culture of inquiry, but then to be explicit about what we're doing and why.
Barb, thank you. This has been such a treat to learn from you today. I know I speak for all of us that we are so honored to have had you with us today. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's been my pleasure. And good luck to you all. I love Colorado.
Yes, come see us.